They sat there, in the quiet corner of a room that felt too large and too bright. The laughter came from somewhere else, from beyond the walls of that small space, and it rolled over them like a wave they could not quite escape. It was not loud at first, only faint, teasing, like the ripple of water across stones. But over time, it settled into their chests, heavy, slow, pressing against the ribs in a way that made breathing feel deliberate, careful. They could feel it before they even understood it, the small ache that came from being watched, from being seen only as a shadow of what they were. The eyes around them did not notice the stillness, the way they held themselves in silence, nor did they see the quiet thought threading through their mind. It was as though the world moved too fast, and they were moving too slowly to be understood. And yet, in that slowness, there was something that stirred, a tiny, almost imperceptible sense of self, tucked beneath the weight of their solitude. Have you ever felt the kind of loneliness that is not loud, not desperate, but calm and knowing? It is the kind that watches the world around it quietly, without interruption. They felt it then, not as sadness alone, but as a presence, as a companion in the stillness. Each laugh that reached their ears became a question instead of a wound. Why do they laugh? What do they see that I do not? Or perhaps, what do they not see at all? The room was filled with small noises too, shuffling feet, the soft scrape of fabric, the careful clearing of a throat. And yet none of these reached the depth of the silence that followed them inward. In that silence, they could feel their own heart beating, slow, steady, reminding them that life existed inside their own chest, not in the eyes or words of others. And sometimes when the pause stretched long enough, they would almost smile at it. The quiet had a shape, a weight, a rhythm that belonged entirely to them. They noticed the way the light shifted across the walls, how shadows stretched and shrank in a dance they did not control but could observe. Each shift carried a small lesson, though they did not name it yet. It was a lesson in patience, in waiting, in seeing before being seen. And the laughter continued outside the edges of this small sanctuary, but it did not intrude as much as it might have before. It was there, yes, but it had lost its power to pull them outward. And yet, the feeling of being unseen remained. They felt it in their hands, resting lightly on their lap. They felt it in their feet, planted firmly on the floor. They felt it in their chest, a quiet pulse that reminded them that they existed even when the world did not notice. How strange, they thought, that something so small as attention, or the lack of it, could shape the body so much. How strange that silence could speak louder than words, if only one listened carefully enough. Sometimes, when the mind wanders in quiet, it begins to notice the rhythm of breathing in others, the patterns of movement, the flicker of expression that goes almost unnoticed. They observed without judgment, without hope for change, simply watching. And in the watching, they began to feel a kind of peace that had nothing to do with being praised or recognized. It was a peace that grew slowly, in the spaces between sounds, in the gaps between laughter and footsteps, in the invisible room that belonged only to them. Perhaps the most difficult part was knowing that the world around them would never pause in the same way. They would continue to move, to speak, to laugh, often without realizing the quiet world that existed beside them. And yet, there was no bitterness in this realization, only a soft understanding. They had learned to carry the stillness inside them, to hold it like a small flame, gentle and steady, protected from the wind outside. And in that quiet sitting alone, they felt a small stirring of something unfamiliar, something neither pride nor shame, but a soft acknowledgement of their own presence. They were here, they breathed, they listened. And for now, that was enough. In the calm, the gentle rhythm of their own heartbeat became the measure of time. In the stillness, they began to understand that silence was not emptiness. It was a companion. It was a mirror. It was the first step towards something they could not yet name, but would come to recognize in its own quiet way, years later. They could hear it before it even reached them, the words carried lightly on the air, as though meant for someone else but landing, inevitably, upon them. At first they were small, almost insignificant, brushing past like the faintest wind across a pond, but each one left a ripple, spreading quietly, reaching into places they did not yet understand. How easily words could settle in the chest, how lightly they could press on the soul without breaking it, yet leaving a memory of weight. They felt it in the silence that followed the laughter, the pause that stretched, delicate and deliberate, as if the world itself had stopped for a moment to watch the effect of what was spoken. It was not cruelty in every word, but carelessness, thoughtless sounds that assumed they could not touch deeply. And yet, they touched. They always touched, and the quiet ache of being lightly struck by attention, by judgment, by observation was something that settled slowly like dust on the skin. Have you ever noticed how some words hang long after they are gone? They do not fade quickly. They linger, resting on the edges of the mind, soft but persistent. And in that lingering, they form a kind of mirror, reflecting back not what is spoken, but how one feels, how one reacts, how one carries the weight of being noticed in such a small, careless way. They felt the mirror now, and it was not flattering, nor was it cruel, it simply existed. It was strange to feel oneself defined not by action, but by the echo of voices that never truly understood. Each careless remark, each quiet mockery became a small, invisible pressure, pressing on the ribs, on the shoulders, on the heart. And yet, they began to notice something subtle. The words, though sharp, were fleeting. They passed like clouds across the sky, shadows that moved, that changed, that did not last forever. It was in this fleetingness that they began to discover something profound, the choice of how to carry them. They began to watch themselves as they listened. Did the words hurt, or did they only appear to hurt because attention was given to them? Could one feel the sting without surrendering to it? The question came softly, without urgency, and yet it demanded reflection. In the quiet of the room, sitting alone, the air around them thick with sounds of others speaking, they realized that every word could be a weight, or it could simply float past if allowed. The mind, they noticed, had a tendency to replay each remark, each teasing tone, as though trying to make sense of it, as though searching for some hidden truth behind the careless sounds. And in that replaying, the quiet ache returned, the gentle tightening in the chest, the soft, slow turning of thoughts inward. It was exhausting in its own subtle way to carry these sounds inside, to give them space where they might not belong. Yet giving them space was also a way of knowing oneself, a way of seeing how the mind responded when rest, when observed, when tested by something that seemed small but felt immense. Sometimes they would close their eyes, let the world fall away for a moment, and listen not to the words themselves, but to the silence that followed. That silence was different. It was empty of judgment, empty of expectation, empty of the weight of other people's fleeting attention. It was a place where they could rest, where the body could loosen, where the heart could breathe again. And in those moments, the words that had seemed so sharp before lost their shape, lost their power, became little more than wind passing through a room that had learned to hold itself still. It was not a sudden understanding. There was no revelation, no bright flash of clarity. It was slower, softer, a gentle unfolding. They began to notice the rhythm of their own heartbeat, the rise and fall of their chest, the subtle tremor of their fingers resting quietly. And as they noticed these things, the weight of careless words began to feel lighter, not because the words themselves had changed, but because they themselves had begun to change. The power to carry or release, to feel or to observe, was quietly, slowly becoming theirs. And in that change, they realized something delicate, almost imperceptible. The world outside would continue to speak, to judge, to laugh without understanding. That would not stop. But inside, in the quiet corners of thought, in the stillness of observation, there was a freedom that had nothing to do with words at all. A freedom born not from denying the sound, but from choosing how to receive it, how to hold it, how to let it drift softly like petals falling on water. They noticed it then, the way the world often misunderstood them, as if they were a book read only by its cover, as if the quiet corners of their mind could never be seen by eyes that hurried past the surface. They tried to move gently through the world, to walk lightly, to speak softly, and yet their intentions were rarely noticed. It was not anger that rose at first, nor bitterness, but a quiet, deep confusion. Why do they see me this way? What do they miss that I hold so clearly within myself? They could feel it in the way glances lingered briefly, then drifted away, leaving only assumptions behind. There was a subtle weight in being misread, an almost invisible pressure that shaped the shoulders without them noticing. And yet, in that weight, there was a strange clarity, a reflection of who they truly were, contrasted sharply against the world's perception. Sometimes they would sit still, letting the room spin gently around them, noticing how little the world seemed to understand the quiet thought, the careful choice, the soft intention that moved beneath the surface. Have you ever felt that the world watches but does not truly see? That eyes are upon you, but the gaze does not reach the part of yourself that matters most? They felt that now, a strange loneliness that was not loud, or bitter but calm and steady, pressing softly into the chest. It was the loneliness of being present, yet invisible, of giving more thought than was noticed, and of holding more care than was returned. And still they did not despair, for in the quiet observation they began to notice patterns, small threads that ran through each encounter, each glance, each gentle misjudgment. They realized that being misunderstood was not always cruel, though it often felt heavy. It was simply the world moving too quickly, too loud, to notice the subtle music of someone who chose silence over noise. And in that realization, a small freedom began to emerge. If no one could truly see the heart behind the actions, perhaps that was not entirely a loss. Perhaps it was a chance to learn to see themselves, to feel themselves, to grow quietly within a space untouched by judgment. The body learned the weight of this quiet isolation. They felt it in the hands resting lightly on the lap, in the subtle tension of the shoulders, in the slow rhythm of breathing that seemed to stretch longer with each thoughtful pause. There was no one to explain to, no one to justify the gentle choices that guided each step, each glance, each word that might be spoken or left unspoken. And sometimes the thought rose, gentle and almost imperceptible, is it better to be understood, or is it enough to simply be? They watched themselves through these moments, observing without judgment the flicker of thought or the rise of emotion before it softened again into quiet. They noticed how small gestures could be mistaken for weakness, how quiet thought could be mistaken for inaction, and how subtle care could be taken for indifference. And yet, even in these misreadings, they began to sense a slow power, a power not shouted or demanded, but present, like the slow turning of the earth beneath the wind and the sky. Sometimes, in the stillness of observation, they felt almost like a shadow moving among others. Not because they were hidden, but because the world moved too quickly to catch the delicate shapes of thought and intention. And in that shadow, there was a kind of peace, a calm understanding that the world's misunderstanding could not diminish what lived quietly within. The heart could still beat, the mind could still turn, the soul could still stretch gently toward its own unseen horizon. It was in these moments, sitting quietly, feeling the soft weight of the chest, noticing the pulse of life in the small details of the body and the air, that they began to recognize the slow unfolding of patience. Being misunderstood became a teacher, a mirror, a guide. They learned to watch the reactions of others without becoming lost in them, to hold the truth of themselves softly without needing confirmation from the outside. And yet, there was a gentle ache that remained not bitter, but tender. A reminder that the world often sees only what it wishes to see. It was a reminder to be gentle with oneself, to hold the quiet self with care, to trust that the unseen and unspoken strength within could grow even when no one else noticed. In this calm observation, they discovered that misunderstanding, while painful, could be shaped into patience, into wisdom, into a quiet resilience that did not need the world's eyes to exist. In the end, they sat still, breathing slowly, feeling the small rise and fall of the chest, listening to the soft hum of life around them, and realized that being misunderstood was not a failure, but a space where the quiet heart could learn its own rhythm. The world might never understand, and yet that did not matter. The inner world, calm and deliberate, could flourish in its own invisible light, and that light, gentle and steady, was enough to carry them through the days, through the laughter, through the quiet moments of being unseen. In the stillness, they began to notice the quiet spaces between each sound, the pauses that existed even in the middle of noise. It was there, in that small distance, that they first heard themselves, not the voice that answered others, not the thoughts that reacted to what was said, but the deeper, softer presence that had always been there, waiting patiently. It was subtle at first, like the faintest rustle of leaves in a gentle wind, easy to miss if one were not listening closely. And yet, once heard, it could not be forgotten. They sat quietly, eyes lowered, letting the room drift around them, letting the laughter and movement pass without reaching too deeply. And in that quiet, they became aware of the thoughts that had always been tucked away, the ones that were too soft to be spoken aloud, the ones that knew the slow truth of who they were. Had they ever truly listened to these thoughts before, or had the noise of the world always carried them away before they could take root? Now, in the calm, there was time to notice, to feel, to understand. The silence itself seemed to hold lessons, though not in words. It spoke through the gentle weight of the body against the floor, the soft rise and fall of breath, the subtle shift of attention from one thought to another. It spoke of patience, of presence, of the quiet power that does not demand recognition. They could feel it stretching outward, as if the stillness within was reaching toward the edges of the room, softening the harshness of the outside world. Have you ever sat so quietly that the world seemed to pause with you, even for a single moment? They felt that now, a gentle slowing of time, a space where the clamor of misunderstanding and judgment could no longer touch them. And in that slowing, they discovered something that had been hidden beneath the constant push and pull of others' expectations, a deep, unspoken knowing of themselves. It was not loud, it did not declare itself, but it was steady, reliable, unshakable. They watched the small movements of their own body, the slight shift of weight, the fingers resting lightly on the lap. Every breath, measured and deliberate, seemed to carry more than air. It carried awareness, presence, a quiet insistence that they were here, that they mattered in a way the world could not define. And as they noticed these things, the silence became fuller, more alive. It was no longer merely the absence of sound. It was a space that held them, cradled them, spoke to them in ways that words could never reach. Sometimes a thought would arise, timid, uncertain, like a small bird peeking from a branch, and they would let it linger, not chasing it away, not forcing it into action, but simply observing it. What does it feel like to be thought without needing to act, to let an idea exist without judgment or urgency? These questions floated gently, unanswered, and in their unanswered state, they became teachers. Each small reflection, each quiet observation, shaped the inner landscape, carving spaces of understanding that no one outside could see. They realized that listening to oneself required more than stillness. It required patience, a soft attention that did not demand immediate understanding. It was like watching a river move slowly, noticing the shimmer of light on its surface, the subtle curve of its path, the way it carried everything gently forward without haste. And as they listened, they began to recognize the ways in which they had been carried by noise before, swept along by the judgments and expectations of others, never noticing the quiet stray nymph that had been there all along. There was a moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, when they sensed that this inner presence had always been alive, always steady, even when they had felt lost or unseen. It had waited quietly beneath the surface, a calm current flowing under the storm of the world. And now, in this silence, it could be felt more clearly, not as something to be used or shown, but simply as something to know, to rest within, to carry softly through every thought, every pause, every breath. In listening to themselves, they discovered a small clarity that life did not need to be loud to be real, that presence did not need attention to exist, that strength could live quietly like a tree standing still in a field, its roots deep, its branches patient, unshaken by the wind. And for the first time, perhaps, they understood that the silence itself was not empty, but full of thought, full of feeling, full of the slow, steady power of simply being. And so they remained there, still and gentle, letting the room breathe around them, letting the noise continue without intrusion, letting the quiet within grow a little stronger with each passing moment. In that quiet, they were whole. In that quiet, they began to know the simple, unspoken truth that in listening to themselves, truly listening, they had found a place no one else could disturb, a space that was calm, alive, and entirely their own. They felt it then, the first gentle stirrings of temptation, the quiet urge to respond, to speak, to defend, to prove that the world had been wrong to overlook them. It was a soft pressure in the chest, a tiny insistence that they should not remain silent, that the words inside demanded release. And yet, they noticed something else, quieter but stronger, the stillness within, the calm that had grown through observation, through listening, through patience. Could one pause long enough to choose instead of reacting? They watched themselves in that moment, as though standing just behind their own eyes, noticing the rise and fall of emotion without needing to act upon it. Each urge that came to the surface was acknowledged, felt fully, yet left untouched. What would it be like, they wondered, to hold the reaction gently, to let it exist like a leaf on a stream, carried forward by its own movement rather than the rush of impulse? It was a strange kind of freedom, to witness the mind so fully without allowing it to control the body. The world continued around them, unaware, speaking without pause, pushing without knowing the quiet resistance growing in that still heart. They could feel the provocation, the subtle tests, the ways others tried to pull them into sound and motion, into judgment and reply. And yet, with each test, they discovered a deeper rhythm, a slower and steadier understanding of what it meant to remain unmoved. To choose silence was not weakness, it was an act of careful attention, a small, deliberate claiming of inner space that no one could touch. Have you ever noticed the weight of restraint, how it differs from mere waiting? To wait is passive, to restrain is active in a quiet way, conscious and deliberate. They began to feel the distinction as they sat in the presence of provocation, feeling the tension in the body, the quick stirrings of the mind, and choosing, again and again, not to respond. Each time they held back a word, a gesture, a sigh, they noticed a small shift in the body, a lightening, a subtle relief, as if the self had been strengthened by the very act of stillness. The mind sought to argue, to demand release, to justify itself. It whispered of unfairness, of injustice, of how the world did not understand. And they listened, gently, letting the words rise and fall within them without needing to act on them. What would it mean, they wondered, to give the world only calm in return for noise? Could silence itself be an answer, a quiet mirror reflecting not anger or complaint, but the steadiness of being. And in wondering this, they felt a small, almost imperceptible power growing, like a spring of water beneath the earth, unseen but persistent. It was not always easy. The temptation to react was subtle but persistent, like the pull of wind against a tree branch, coaxing it to sway, to break the calm. And yet, they began to notice that the more they did not react, the more the mind settled, the more the body relaxed, the more the space inside became theirs alone. There was a rhythm to it, a gentle unfolding, a slow understanding that strength was not measured by noise, by rebuttal, or by the visible claim of attention, but by the ability to remain present, to remain quiet, to remain grounded when the world sought to unsettle them. They felt a clarity in this silence, a new kind of observation. What had once seemed like tension now became energy, a slow, steady current flowing beneath the surface. They could feel their own heartbeat, the subtle rise and fall of breath, the quiet certainty that came from knowing they were choosing, moment by moment, how to exist in a world that often demanded reaction. There was a strange dignity in this, a quiet respect for themselves that no other voice could take away. Sometimes the urge returned, stronger, sharper, calling for release, for sound, for defense, and they allowed it to be felt, to be acknowledged. But they did not act. They noticed how the pause itself became longer, how the quiet grew heavier with meaning, how restraint transformed into a kind of calm authority that did not need words to exist. What could be louder, what could be stronger than the gentle refusal to be moved by the world's impatience? And in this gentle refusal, they discovered something profound. The choice of silence was a gift to themselves, a quiet protection of the inner life that had grown slowly, carefully, through observation and patience. It was a space where provocation could pass without leaving harm, where emotion could exist without spilling outward, where the self could remain whole and unbroken. They felt the weight of this power, soft but steady, flowing quietly through the chest, and realized that this was not just restraint. It was a kind of quiet mastery, a slow, deliberate cultivation of inner freedom. As they sat there, breathing gently, listening to the faint rhythm of life around them, they understood at last that choosing silence over reaction was not a loss, nor a surrender. It was the first step toward a strength that could not be shaken, a calm that could not be disturbed, a respect for themselves that needed no witness. And in that stillness, in that quiet choice, they felt a small, unwavering peace begin to settle, like a stone finding its place at the bottom of a stream, unmoved by the ripples above. They began to notice something subtle, almost imperceptible, growing within them, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with the world outside, and everything to do with the stillness they carried inside. It was not a strength of force or noise, but of patience, of careful observation, of the ability to remain steady when everything around them sought to pull them into reaction. How strange, they thought, that power could be so soft, so gentle, and yet so real. It moved slowly, this inner power, like water carving its path through stone. Each moment of restraint, each pause before a word, each choice to remain unmoved added to it, shaped it, made it stronger. And yet it was not something they could hold up and show. It was invisible, delicate, almost sacred in its quiet persistence. Could one imagine a strength that cannot be measured, cannot be seen, yet carries the weight of the world without strain? That was what was forming within them now. They felt it in the body first, a subtle straightening of the spine, a soft widening of the chest, a sense of grounding that had not been there before. The breath became deeper, slower, carrying a calm that spread through the limbs, through the heart, through the mind. It was not sudden, nor was it loud. It was a gentle unfolding, like a flower opening quietly at dawn, unnoticed by the rush of the day but full of its own quiet life. Have you ever felt something grow within, so slowly that you hardly notice it until one day you do? They felt it now. It was the culmination of all the small choices they had made, all the quiet pauses, all the soft observations. It was the sum of every moment they had chosen calm over noise, reflection over reaction, presence over distraction, and in that sum they felt a kind of power that was soft, patient, and unshakable. It was different from anything they had known before. There was no pride in it, no desire to display it, no need to convince anyone of it. It simply existed quietly, like a steady flame in a room of shadows. And the world could test, it could provoke, it could press and push, but this power remained, untouched by insult, unmoved by judgment, unbroken by misunderstanding. There was a beauty in this, a soft satisfaction that came not from victory, but from the gentle knowing of one's own center. They began to notice the mind's subtle shifts, the way it had once tumbled at every sound, every remark, every glance. And now the mind moved differently. It observed, it noticed, it acknowledged, but it did not rush. It did not push to act. The thoughts were like clouds passing slowly across a sky that was wide and still, neither chasing them nor holding them back. And in this new rhythm, they found a quiet delight, a soft contentment that came not from what the world thought of them, but from what they had discovered within. It was not always easy to maintain. Sometimes old habits, old instincts rose like small waves, calling for reaction, calling for noise, calling for the release of energy long held inside. And yet, with each wave, they learned something new. They learned that power is not in force, but in choice. They learned that stillness could hold more than words, more than actions, more than the clamor of those who do not see. And slowly, they began to understand that true strength was the quiet kind, the kind that waits, the kind that observes, the kind that needs no audience to exist. They could feel it expanding beyond the chest, beyond the mind, beyond the small room they occupied. It was a gentle radiance, a soft insistence that they were whole, even when the world did not recognize it. It touched their hand, their feet, their quiet pulse. And in that touch was a sense of being fully present, fully alive, fully themselves. There was a slow clarity that came with this awareness, a recognition that life itself was less frightening when one carried such quiet strength within. Have you noticed how small acts of patience accumulate, how tiny choices shape something larger, something unseen, something unshakable? They noticed it now. Each day, each quiet decision, each careful observation had built this power, like layers of stone forming a quiet fortress within the soul. And in knowing this, they felt a deep sense of comfort, a soft trust in themselves that no word of mockery or misunderstanding could disturb, and so they sat, breathing slowly, feeling the subtle currents of strength moving through the body, the mind, the heart. The world continued as it always had, loud, restless, unpredictable. But inside them, there was a calm, steady force, a quiet authority, a gentle power that needed no witness, no applause, no validation. And in this quiet power, they felt themselves beginning to settle fully, softly, into a life that was unshakable, not because of what the world gave them, but because of what they had nurtured within. Years had passed, and the world had shifted in ways that were quiet but undeniable. They noticed it first in small gestures, in the hesitation of glances, in the soft pauses that seemed to carry weight where before there had been none. Those who had once spoken lightly of them, who had once laughed or judged without care, now moved differently around them. There was a subtle change, an unspoken recognition, though not quite of who they were, but of something they had become. They could feel it before it was spoken, a quiet uncertainty in the air, and when the words finally came, they were careful, slow, as though testing the boundaries of this new presence. They spoke softly, asking for guidance, for understanding, for help. Things that once might have seemed too small or too late, but now carried an unusual weight, and they noticed quietly how the world leaned upon them, seeking what had always existed inside, a calm and steady force that did not need to be announced. Have you ever watched the world come to you years later in a way that feels both strange and familiar? They felt it then, the odd mixture of distance and closeness, of recognition and unknowing. It was not triumph that filled them, nor resentment, nor pride. It was a quiet noticing, a soft awareness that life had a way of moving in circles, of returning, of unfolding in patience. What had once been dismissed or overlooked now approached gently, seeking something that had always been quietly present. They did not rush to speak, nor did they move with haste. There was no need. Years of quiet observation, of deliberate silence, of patient restraint, had taught them that true power moves slowly. And so they waited, allowing the questions to form fully, allawi, ng, the need to be expressed without interference. How strange it was, they thought, that the world had come asking for what could never have been taken by force, only cultivated in stillness, only grown through time. The presence they had carried within, so soft and invisible before, now felt tangible, not because it had changed in size or strength, but because it was finally seen, even if only partially through the eyes of those who had once failed to understand. And yet, they did not take satisfaction in being recognized. There was no joy in having been proved right, no quiet revenge in the acknowledgement. The power they held was too gentle, too deliberate, too serene to need such validation. They noticed how the world moved around them differently now. The laughter had become hesitant, the careless words tempered with caution, the assumptions weighed with thought, and they observed it quietly, noting how much of this change was genuine, and how much was born of need, born of seeking, born of the recognition that some things cannot be rushed, cannot be forced, cannot be borrowed from someone else. They had learned long ago that strength, patience, and calm grow quietly, and that they cannot be hurried into being seen. Have you ever felt the weight of someone else's dependence, soft and almost invisible, pressing not as demand but as hope? They felt it now in the quiet requests, in the soft questions, in the unspoken need that reached them across the years, and in this, they realized something gentle yet profound. A world may return, but what is offered now can only be given with the same patience, the same calm, the same quiet authority that had been cultivated over years of stillness. It cannot be rushed, cannot be forced, cannot be taken lightly. They breathed slowly, noticing the soft rhythm of the chest, the steady rise and fall of awareness, the gentle understanding that they could be present without surrendering themselves. To offer guidance, to meet need, to respond with care, these were acts of quiet power, not of obligation, not of pride, not of retribution. They felt the difference, subtle but unmistakable, between responding from impatience or desire and responding from presence, from the calm authority that years of observation and restraint had shaped within them. And as the moments passed, as the questions were asked and the attention turned toward them, they felt a deep, gentle satisfaction, not in the recognition itself, but in the calm that had allowed it to arrive naturally. Nothing was forced, nothing was claimed. The world had returned, yes, but it was met with something stronger than words or action. It was met with the steady, unshakable stillness of a life lived quietly, carefully, fully within itself. In that quiet space, they felt the soft unfolding of understanding. The years of silence, the careful restraint, the patient observation had not been wasted. They had been gathering a strength that did not shout, Aka, LM, that did not need witness, a presence that could meet the world without losing itself. And as they sat there, listening to the hesitant voices, noticing the subtle shift of attention, they understood that this was not a moment of triumph, but a moment of quiet, deliberate fulfillment, a recognition that true power, once grown, could not be taken away and could move gently through the world without disturbance. They sat quietly, feeling the soft rhythm of life move gently around them. The years had passed, and with them came a calm that was not loud, not demanding, not eager to prove itself to the world. It simply existed, steady and patient, like the slow turning of the earth beneath the sky, like a river that carries everything without rushing, without force. They could feel it now, deep in the chest, in the steady pulse of breath, in the gentle rise and fall of the body. The world could still speak, still move, still press against the quiet corners of life, but they were no longer moved by it. They had learned to observe without surrendering, to notice without reacting, to exist fully without needing validation. And in this presence there was a strange freedom, a soft kind of power that did not announce itself, that did not demand recognition, that rested quietly in its own knowing. Could one ever feel more alive than in such stillness, such calm, such unshakable attention to the self? They noticed the small details that had always been there but had been overlooked. In the rush of life, the subtle tremor of air moving across the room, the faint echo of footsteps far away, the slow settling of dust in the corners. And with each small observation came a gentle understanding, a quiet satisfaction that the world could move as it would, and still they would remain whole. There was a strange beauty in this, a soft comfort in knowing that nothing outside could truly disturb what had been quietly nurtured inside. Have you ever felt the difference between being calm because the world is calm, and being calm because you have carried your own peace within? They felt it now, fully, in the bones and the chest, in the soft whisper of thought that flowed without need for reaction. The laughter, the questions, the old judgments of others, none of it reached the place where they now rested. And in that separation there was no bitterness, no pride, only a quiet, unspoken dignity that came from knowing oneself so fully that the world could no longer unsettle them. They breathed slowly, deliberately, feeling the small, steady strength that had been built over years of careful observation, of restraint, of quiet attention. It was not forceful, it did not seek to dominate, it did not demand respect. It simply existed, like a tree planted deeply in the earth, roots hidden but firm, branches stretching softly toward the sky. And in this stillness, they understood that true power had never been in being seen or acknowledged. It had always been here quietly, waiting for the moment when it could simply be known without noise or disturbance. Sometimes a thought would drift in, curious, lingering. What would it mean to carry this calm into every day, into every encounter, into every moment that might otherwise bring worry or unrest? And they would feel the answer settle gently, like water finding its place in a stone basin. It meant being whole in oneself, fully present, neither taken by the praise nor undone by the criticism of others. It meant that life could move freely, yet the center of their being would remain unmoved, quiet, steady. They noticed the small tremors of emotion that once had led them to speak too quickly, to react too sharply, to give power to words that were not theirs to hold. And now those tremors existed only as faint echoes, reminders of the journey that had brought them here. They could feel the careful cultivation of patience in every breath, the soft authority of restraint in every heartbeat, the gentle assurance of self-respect in every quiet thought. It was not a lesson taught by others, not a victory over anyone, but a slow and steady becoming of something unseen, yet unshakable. Have you ever felt the soft settling of a life that has been carefully tended, the quiet satisfaction of a soul that is no longer moved by the turbulence of the world? They felt it now, in every fiber, every pulse, every quiet corner of attention. And in that stillness there was no rush, no need, no expectation. Only the soft unfolding of presence, the gentle acknowledgement of being fully alive in oneself, the quiet certainty that nothing outside could diminish the calm that had been built slowly, deliberately, with care and patience. And so they remained there, breathing softly, listening to the faint sounds around them, feeling the steady rhythm of life within. The world continued to move, to speak, to test, but it no longer mattered in the same way. The calm had become a home, a refuge, a strength that was not loud but could not be broken. And in that gentle stillness they understood something simple and unshakable, that true peace is not given, it is grown, it is not found in the eyes of others, but in the quiet knowing of oneself carried softly, fully, always. They sat quietly, feeling the gentle weight of their own presence, noticing the slow rhythm of life within them. The years had passed, and with them came a sense of completion, not loud or sudden, but soft and steady, like the tide drawing back after a long, patient sweep. They were aware of how far they had traveled, not through distance, but through the quiet shaping of themselves, the slow tending of a life that had been lived carefully, deliberately, in the spaces between noise and haste. It was in these quiet moments that they understood the depth of their own growth. Every pause, every restraint, every choice to remain still when the world demanded reaction had built a strength that could not be measured, could not be seen, and yet was undeniable in its presence. How strange, they thought, that the smallest acts, silence instead of reply, observation instead of argument, patience instead of impatience, had become the foundation of something so vast inside. They noticed the subtle ways their mind had changed over time. Thoughts that once rose quickly, demanding action, now moved gently, like leaves floating on a slow river. There was no rush to answer, no insistence on proving a point, no need to bend the world to their will, and in this new rhythm, there was a soft clarity, a delicate knowing that they could meet life without losing themselves, that the world's judgment could pass without leaving a mark, that their own presence was enough. Have you ever felt the quiet satisfaction of simply being without explanation, without defense, without applause? They felt it now deeply, in the slow rise and fall of the chest, in the steady pulse of the hands resting lightly on the lap, in the calm that flowed through every corner of their attention. The world could still move, still speak, still test, and yet they remained undisturbed, not through force, not through cleverness, but through the steady cultivation of inner stillness that had grown over years of quiet observation. They became aware of the small pleasures that had always existed, unnoticed in the rush of life. The softness of air on the skin, the gentle shift of light across the room, the faint echo of sound in the distance. All of it felt alive now, carrying subtle meaning, carrying the evidence of life's slow unfolding. And in noticing these things, they realized that the richness of life is often found not in noise, but in quiet attention. Not in others' acknowledgement, but in the careful presence of one's own being. Sometimes a thought would drift in, almost like a question whispered by the wind. What does it mean to respect oneself fully, to live without needing the world to approve? And they felt the answer settle quietly. It is to carry your own dignity in each breath, to move gently through the hours without losing the steady center that has been shaped from patience, from restraint, from the slow practice of listening to oneself. In this, they found a kind of freedom that no noise could disturb, no misunderstanding could cloud, no expectation could limit. They noticed the body, the soft rise and fall of breath, the gentle pulse of the heartbeat, the quiet weight of hands and feet resting in stillness. Each movement was deliberate, yet effortless, a reflection of the calm that had grown from years of careful tending. And they understood that life does not need to be loud to be full, does not need to be seen to be real, does not need the world's praise to be meaning. full. Presence alone is enough if it is cultivated with patience and care. Have you ever felt the deep contentment that comes from living fully within your own space without needing to prove yourself, without needing the eyes of others to validate your existence? They felt it now, and it filled the quiet room like a soft, steady light. There was no rush to claim it, no need to announce it, no pressure to share it. It simply was, and that was enough. The calm they had grown over the years had become a companion, a guide, a gentle authority that moved with them silently, always present, always steady. They thought of all the moments that had brought them here, the moments of laughter endured, the words absorbed, the judgments faced, the quiet watching, the pauses, the restraint, the listening. Each had been a small step, a careful shaping of the self, and each had mattered. And in that reflection they felt a soft gratitude, not for the world's recognition, but for the life they had lived fully, deliberately, quietly, and without compromise. And so they remained there, breathing slowly, listening softly, feeling the gentle pulse of life within, and understood at last that the deepest strength, the truest peace, the most lasting dignity comes not from others, but from the quiet care one takes in cultivating the self. It is soft, it is steady, it is unshakable, and it carries through every moment of life, like a slow river that flows quietly, carrying everything it meets with calm, with patience, with presence.